Thank you, Frank. Well, we really are a lot closer together on the spectrum than we thought when we were having an argument beforehand.
I knew.
So I want to talk about three questions this evening. Firstly, why do we care about housing affordability for home buyers in particular? So I agree entirely with you. There are other people for whom housing affordability is much more severe. Secondly, talk about what questions we aren't asking, what isn't in the public realm about the decisions that we are taking. And then, sorry. And then what are some answers to these questions, and what are the problems with most of the answers? Because there is no easy solution to what we're talking about this evening. So to start off with, why do we care? I think there are three big reasons, and I'm framing them in terms that are relatively economically focused, because I think that's what makes a stronger argument than just saying we should have a social welfare network that works better than it does. I think the three big reasons for me are, firstly, the economic vulnerability that you create when people are not able to move into home ownership at a relatively early age, particularly by the time, when you look at what happens to people after retirement, given the changes that have occurred to the super fund, and retirement savings in general, without owning a property, people are in much greater need of social assistance by the time they get to retirement age. So the affordability problems that we're creating now with younger home buyers entering home ownership later and later in life, and thus in many cases retiring with quite significant debt still, those are going to be significant social welfare costs for Australia down the line. The second reason, I think, is the costs of social inequality. Frank was just talking about, expecting Australia to have a reasonable social welfare system and the distinction between the United States and Australia. I moved here from the US in 2008, and it was striking and wonderful to be in a society that was relatively less unequal. I'd moved to America, though, from South Africa in the 1980s, and I'd moved thinking South Africa was the very worst place in the world. But the first weekend, I was we took a train into Manhattan and saw what was happening to homeless people in the train station locally, how the police were treating them. And the costs of that social inequality were very significant. It was a different level of social inequality than South Africa had been. But it's very troubling to see Sydney, Australia more generally, moving into those realms where social inequality is much sharper. And I think one of the key aspects where social inequality is being sharpened further still is as we're moving into a two-tier system of people who have parents to provide them with a down payment to move into home ownership versus people who don't have parents who can do that. And of course, a lot of the people who don't have parents who can do that are relatively recent immigrants, people in lower wage jobs, but also predominantly people from ethnic minorities. And I think we're creating a much less equal society that's going to have significant social costs that we don't fully understand at this point. Or we don't understand collectively at this point. The third issue is a sort of, in some ways, a more self-interested one. As an academic manager, I've been trying to recruit some of the best and brightest academic talent internationally and in Australia to come and work for us. Very difficult indeed, given the costs that they'd be facing moving to Sydney as a homeowner market. So we talk there's a little bit of lip service given to communities where police officers and school teachers can't afford to live. That's certainly a significant problem. There are problems further down the income distribution with people providing the services that, making the coffee and all of the other things that make urban life wonderful. But there's also quite significant problems fairly further up the income distribution. University professors are not paid that badly. We're certainly doing a lot better than many of the people at, further down on the income distribution, but it's still very unattractive as a housing market. And although Sydney's a very attractive city to live in, we're having, I think, long-term effects on our economic growth, particularly if we're serious about focusing on developing a knowledge economy, developing creative industries, developing innovation, not just in terms of the wages that people are being offered are not covering housing costs anymore, whereas they were perhaps 10 years ago, but also entrepreneurs have faced much greater risks maintaining a new startup business in a housing market like this, given the, just their basic costs. So I think Sydney's facing some longer-term economic development problems as a result of what has happened to affordability in this city. So some of the questions that we aren't asking, there isn't a very explicit debate about exactly what we're subsidizing now and whether it's actually a useful thing. And I'm using the word useful from the point of view of, do we really want the behavior that we're subsidizing, and would we get that behavior without subsidy? Up until, investors are still significantly subsidized in this housing market, and as Frank was just describing, investor involvement in the market has been one of the biggest drivers of inflation in this last sort of boom cycle. It may be reasonable to subsidize investors, but in that case we should be getting something back from it. And we're not getting anything back in the form of lower rents that would be really doing something for affordability. So I don't think we've had a very explicit conversation about exactly what it is we're subsidizing and whether, in fact, it makes any sense to subsidize the behavior we have been. The second set of issues here is, are the why we care reasons really good enough to justify subsidizing home ownership instead of investment in home ownership, in housing? I think that's an interesting question for us to have. That's not a debate that's been very broadly discussed. But I think there are some pragmatic reasons why a small amount of subsidy at this point can actually avoid significant, much longer-term costs that I've just identified in the social welfare system, in terms of foregone economic growth, in terms of the costs of increasingly sharp social inequality. So, yes, renters are definitely in much more dire circumstances than homeowners are, and it's always a dilemma in talking about affordability, that problems that affect middle-class people to a greater extent are much more likely to be at the front of the agenda. But I think that isn't a reason to abandon the discussion about the affordability of home ownership. So, some answers to these questions. What is the most effective way to subsidize homeowners if we do accept the arguments above that I've just been making? There aren't any really good answers to this question. The United States does a lot more complex incentive packaging, subsidy packaging. It's framed in terms that benefit a wide array of relatively powerful groups, banks, investors, and that's what generally is necessary to get subsidies accepted politically. But none of those strategies are really very effective. I think it's worth going through what some of the key areas are that we could address. I think definitely a point Frank made, taking away barriers in the form of the upfront stamp duty and the significant transaction costs in moving into home ownership, and replacing those with annual property taxes that are tied to increases in value, would go a lot further towards taxing wealth as opposed to taxing people at the point where they're just struggling over the barrier from renting into home ownership. All of the consequences in terms of, tightening up or solidifying the housing market and limiting the extent to which people move out of larger homes into more, more appropriate accommodation, leaving older, larger homes for families who would benefit more from those. There are very good arguments to be made there. And that's not fundamentally an impossible thing to do. It's actually quite easy to design a system where you could phase that in. Another approach is to look at lowering the costs of financing still further. I know financing is quite low now, but the most significant problem with financing, though, is the sort of risk that people are incurring when they take on a mortgage. And in an environment where almost all mortgages are variable rate, there's a significant risk placed on home buyers who don't have a lot of assets behind them and who are just managing to afford the debt they're taking on at the beginning of their purchase. So that would be a really useful thing to do from the point of view of first home buyers. And there are some good ways to package that. There are schemes that use tax-free yields on below market fixed rate loans that de-risk the transaction from the point of view of home buyers, that do provide some benefits to investors, but at a very small scale. There's always leakage, though, in any of those systems, and there are always creative ways that they can be perverted into providing, into diverting the subsidy essentially to people who were not meant to be, who were not the intended recipients of that subsidy. So I think it's quite correct to have a deep level of skepticism about the extent to which governments can design incentive programs that really work, but there are better and worse ways to do that, and delivering those benefits in the form of tax credits that go directly to the home buyer is a good way to limit some of that leakage. The other key barrier to home ownership that I think we could address more effectively is countering the effect of the concentration of wealth, where people whose parents have lots of property and lots of assets are able to move into home ownership quite easily, while those whose parents don't are not. I think there's an interesting set of issues around developing shared equity participation with super fund investors, perhaps as one example. There would probably have to be a role for the Commonwealth government in de-risking that equity sharing. De-risking is a source of moral hazard. We saw that happening with the secondary mortgage markets in the United States over the last decade. Well, that really, I mean, there were several periods at which that became particularly problematic. So it's not a simple solution, but it would address some portion of what keeps people from home ownership. A final solution is one that's more related to planning, and I know you're going to heave a sigh of frustration here. I'm not talking about regulation. What I'm talking about is doing more, taking a stronger role in evening out the price gradients of land and evening out the value of location by significant investments in high-speed rail links that would make it much more feasible for first home buyers to get a foothold in markets that are still relatively reasonably priced given wages, and still allow people to work in Sydney, where or in the major regional centre, where they're actually going to earn wages sufficient to cover those housing costs. So investment in high-speed rail you could think of that as a spatial strategy. Instead of subsidising housing, subsidise transport as an alternative.
Don't build West Connex.
I'm talking about high-speed rail, not sitting in highways in a car and being forced to own a car for every working adult and for every child who's in university. That's not a very affordable solution, and it's certainly not affordable from a social perspective. A significant investment in high-speed rail now, at this point in Australia's future, would do a lot to stimulate job growth in the short term, make up for some of the depression, some of the decline we're seeing as a result of the rollbacks in mining that Frank was talking about. It does involve a time cost, but for many home buyers, that would be a reasonable trade-off between a mortgage where they're stretched far too thin and are just a paycheck away from absolute catastrophe, or from not getting into home ownership at all. It's not a perfect solution, but it would make a contribution to the affordability problems that we're seeing now.